The Panther had been positioned in the hedgerow for 40 minutes, engine idling at barely audible levels. Its long 75mm KWK-42 gun trained on the gap where German spotters reported American armor would emerge. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter, the gunner, had his eye pressed to the Turmzielfernrohr optic, watching the shimmering heat distortion above the Norman fields. When the Sherman appeared, hull down, turret traversing cautiously, Richter's training took over with mechanical precision. Range, 800 meters. Target moving left to right at walking speed. Lead calculated. Aiming point, right sponson, just above the track assembly, where intelligence diagrams showed the ammunition racks clustered in vulnerable stowage. One penetration there, and the entire tank would cook off in seconds. Panzergranate, Richter called calmly. Bereit, the loader confirmed, slamming the round home. Richter squeezed the trigger. The gun roared. The Panther rocked backward against its suspension. Through the optic, Richter saw the tracer streak across the gap and punch through the Sherman's side armor with a bright spark of impact. Perfect hit. Textbook penetration exactly where it needed to be. He kept his eye in the sight, waiting for the secondary detonation. The geyser of orange flame erupting from every hatch. The turret blown skyward by exploding ammunition. The black smoke pillar that always followed a sponson hit. 5 seconds passed. 10. The Sherman slowed, then stopped. Richter felt his stomach tighten. Why isn't it burning? Did you miss? The commander asked from above, voice sharp with suspicion. 9, Richter snapped. Direct hit. I saw the penetration. But instead of fire, the Sherman's turret began to move. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed. The long barrel of its 76mm gun swinging toward their position like the snout of a predator catching a scent. Richter could see the muzzle brake clearly now, centered in his optic, growing larger. They're still fighting, the loader whispered, disbelief cracking his voice. The commander's hand slapped Richter's shoulder. Load another round! Schnell! But the confusion had already spread like poison through the crew. The driver, hearing the panic in his commander's voice, lurched the Panther backward without orders, breaking the carefully prepared firing position. The loader fumbled the next shell, nearly dropping it. Richter's hands, steady moments before, now trembled as he tried to reacquire the target through an optic jostled by movement. That Sherman should have been a funeral pyre. Every engagement they'd fought in Russia, every captured American tank they'd inspected at Kummersdorf, every tactical bulletin from OKW had promised the same outcome. Hit the ammunition and the tank dies. But this one refused to die. Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get back to the story. The Sherman fired first. Its 76mm shell screamed past the Panther's turret with a sound like tearing fabric, missing by less than a meter. The German crew didn't wait for a second shot. The driver slammed the transmission into reverse, and the Panther crashed backward through the hedgerow, branches scraping against steel, leaving the inexplicable American tank still sitting in the field, wounded but alive. Inside the Panther, no one spoke. They had done everything correctly. And somehow, it hadn't been enough. The Americans called it their first major defeat in the European theater. The Germans called it target practice. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia, February 14, 1943. The valley floor became a graveyard of burning M4 Shermans, their hulls glowing cherry red in the North African twilight. Smoke columns rose so thick they were visible from Allied positions 15 miles away. Of the 300 American tanks committed to the battle, 183 were destroyed, and nearly all of them burned. Not some of them, nearly all of them. British operational research teams arrived 3 days later to conduct what amounted to mechanical autopsies. They photographed every hulk, measured every penetration, documented every burn pattern. Their report, classified until 1958, contained a statistic that would haunt U.S. Ordnance planners for the next year. 65% of knocked-out Shermans had burned completely, often with crews still inside. American studies showed worse numbers. In some engagements, the fire rate reached 80%. Bank crews began using a nickname that cut deeper than any German propaganda: Ronsons. After the cigarette lighter advertised to light the first time, every time. Some units painted the slogan on their tanks as gallows humor. Others refused to discuss it at all. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department's Tank Automotive Center in Detroit received orders to determine why Shermans burned so readily. Engineers expected to find fuel system vulnerabilities, ruptured tanks, exposed lines, poor fire suppression. What they discovered was far worse. It wasn't the gasoline, it was the ammunition. Every Sherman carried 75 rounds of 75mm ammunition stored in open-frame racks mounted along the sponson walls, the hull sides above the tracks. These racks positioned shells vertically, noses pointing downward, with only thin canvas bags separating brass cartridges from the steel hull interior. When an armor-piercing shell penetrated the sponson, it didn't need to hit the ammunition directly. The impact created white-hot fragments and spalling that ricocheted through the fighting compartment at supersonic speeds. One fragment striking one propellant charge was enough. The initial flash would ignite adjacent rounds within milliseconds. The fire spread through the rack like a fuse, detonating shell after shell in a chain reaction. Temperatures inside the hull reached 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit within seconds, hot enough to melt steel, consume oxygen, and kill every crew member before they could react. Tankers who survived described the sound. Not an explosion, but a roar, like opening a blast furnace door. At German tank schools from Paderborn to Putlos, instructors began incorporating the Sherman's weakness into standard gunnery training. Tactical bulletins distributed to every panzer unit contained detailed diagrams of M4 ammunition placement. The sponson racks were highlighted in red with a simple instruction: primary aiming point, ammunition storage. Range cards issued to anti-tank gun crews marked the sponson area with cross-hatching. Training films showed captured Shermans being fired upon, the camera zooming in as flames erupted from hatches within seconds of penetration. German after-action reports began describing Sherman kills with cold efficiency: sponson hit, ammunition fire, total loss. The doctrine became embedded so deeply that veteran panzer crews could identify Sherman variants by silhouette at 1,500 meters and place their first shot into the ammunition racks with mechanical precision. It was a doctrine built on blood, statistics, and repeated success. And by the time it became obsolete, not a single German intelligence officer would realize it. They arrived in Tunisia with notebooks, measuring tapes, and cameras, not weapons. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department's field service teams looked more like insurance adjusters than combat personnel, but their mission was just as urgent as any infantry assault: determine why American tanks were dying at rates that threatened to lose the war. Major Thomas L. Sherburne led the primary investigation team. A mechanical engineer from Detroit who'd spent the 1930s designing automotive frames, he now walked through fields of burned-out Shermans with the methodical precision of a coroner performing an autopsy. Each wreck told a story. Sherburne's team tagged every hull, photographed every penetration, measured entry and exit angles, documented burn patterns, cataloged which components had melted and which remained intact. They crawled inside tanks where temperatures still exceeded 100 degrees days after the battle, sketching fragment patterns on clipboards while wearing canvas gloves to avoid burning their hands on scorched metal. The data accumulated across weeks revealed a pattern so consistent it became undeniable. Fuel tanks, when penetrated, rarely caused catastrophic fires. The gasoline would burn, yes, but slowly, giving crews time to bail out. Engine fires were survivable. Hydraulic fluid fires were containable. Even hits to the ammunition in the turret often resulted in localized fires that crews could escape. But sponson hits were death sentences. Sherman's team documented 63 Shermans with clear penetrations into the right or left sponson area. Of those 63, 61 had burned completely. The two that hadn't were cases where the ammunition had already been expended before the hit. The kill mechanism was brutally simple. When an 88mm armor-piercing round punched through the sponson plate at 10,600 feet per second, it created a cone of molten steel fragments that sprayed through the interior like a shotgun blast. These fragments, traveling at hundreds of meters per second, heated to incandescent temperatures, would strike the open ammunition racks mounted directly against the hull wall. One fragment, one propellant bag, one spark. The resulting fire wasn't an explosion in the conventional sense. It was a deflagration, a subsonic combustion wave that consumed every propellant charge in the rack within 2 to 3 seconds. Each charge added more heat, more pressure, more combustion gases. The brass cartridge cases would rupture. The high-explosive shells would detonate. The entire sponson would become a corridor of flame extending from the driver's position to the assistant driver's station. Crew survival time, under 5 seconds from penetration to lethal atmosphere. Sherman's preliminary report reached the Ordnance Department in Washington on March 8, 1943. His conclusion was typed in capital letters across the summary page. Ammunition stowage location is the primary vulnerability. Fuel is secondary. Sponson placement of main gun rounds creates unacceptable crew mortality rate. Attached to the report were 63 photographs of burned tanks, each with the penetration point circled in grease pencil. The pattern was so obvious that even non-technical staff could see it. Hit the side, ignite the ammunition, lose the tank and crew. The question now was whether American industry could solve a problem that German gunners had learned to exploit with lethal efficiency. The answer would require flooding a tank with water, and then making it work without drowning the crew. The first proposal sounded insane. Flood the entire fighting compartment with 6 inches of water. The suggestion came from a Navy liaison officer attending an Ordnance Department crisis meeting in April 1943. His logic was straightforward. Submarines operated with watertight compartments and emergency flooding systems. Why not apply the same principle to tanks? The Army engineers stared at him in silence. Then someone pointed out that tank crews needed to move inside their vehicle, walk, load ammunition, operate controls, not swim. Water sloshing around their feet would freeze in winter, slosh during movement, corrode electrical systems, and add thousands of pounds of dead weight. The idea was politely noted and immediately dismissed. But the concept refused to die. A chemical engineer from DuPont named Robert Hausman, contracted to advise on fire suppression systems, raised his hand at the next meeting. "What if we don't flood the whole compartment?" he asked. "What if we just surround the ammunition itself with liquid?" The room went quiet. Hausman sketched on a chalkboard. Double-walled containers, ammunition stored in the inner chamber, liquid filling the gap between walls. If a penetrator struck the bin, the liquid would flood out, soaking any exposed propellant before it could ignite. Even if fire started, the liquid would prevent it from spreading to adjacent rounds. The concept was elegant in theory. Implementation proved brutally complex. Early prototypes resembled miniature aquariums, sealed boxes with glass viewing ports so engineers could observe liquid behavior during testing. Aberdeen Proving Ground received the first experimental bins in June 1943. Technicians filled them with water, loaded them with live 75mm rounds, and fired German 88mm guns at them from 500 meters. The first test was promising. The bin ruptured, water flooded out, and the ammunition didn't ignite. The second test, conducted in freezing conditions, was a disaster. The water had frozen solid overnight, turning the fire suppression system into a useless block of ice. Engineers tried adding salt. It lowered the freezing point, but corroded the brass cartridge cases within days, leaving green oxidation that could jam guns. They tried oil. It didn't freeze, but it also didn't suppress fires effectively and created slip hazards when spilled inside the tank. The breakthrough came in August 1943. Ethylene glycol mixed with water, rust inhibitors, and biocides. The mixture, eventually trademarked as ammudamp, remained liquid to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, prevented corrosion, inhibited bacterial growth in stagnant liquid, and actually improved fire suppression compared to pure water. The final design was deceptively simple. Each ammunition bin consisted of 2 concentric steel shells with a 1.5-inch gap between them. This gap held approximately half a gallon of ammudamp per 10-round cell. The bins were positioned in the hull floor, the lowest point in the tank, away from likely impact zones, with armored access hatches for loading and liquid inspection ports for maintenance. Press Steel Car Company in Pennsylvania received retrofit orders in October 1943. Their production lines, already running 24 hours producing standard Shermans, now had to incorporate the new bins without slowing output. By December, the first modified hull rolled through quality control. On January 3, 1944, the first M4A376W, the W officially designating Wet-Stowage, left the factory floor. German intelligence, still analyzing Shermans captured in Tunisia 9 months earlier, never noticed the modification. The modification happened in silence. No press releases, no newsreel footage, no patriotic radio broadcasts celebrating American ingenuity. On January 3, 1944, the first M4A376W Sherman rolled off Press Steel Car Company's assembly line in Pennsylvania, looking identical to every other Sherman produced that week, except for a single letter stamped on its data plate. Most factory workers didn't know what it meant. Tank crews receiving the new vehicles weren't briefed on the significance. Even maintenance personnel saw only cryptic technical bulletins referencing modified ammunition stowage without explaining the system's purpose or mechanics. The secrecy was intentional. Ordnance Department planners feared that publicizing the modification would alert German intelligence to the vulnerability it addressed, and to the fact that older Shermans still lacked the protection. But silence created its own problems. When the first wet-stowage Shermans arrived at training facilities, crews noticed the differences immediately. The hull floor sat slightly higher, the ammunition racks were relocated, and strange liquid-filled inspection ports appeared near the driver's position. Rumors spread. Some crews thought the liquid was coolant for a new gun system. Others believed it was additional hydraulic fluid. A few suspected it was experimental fire suppression, but without official explanation, they couldn't be certain. Maintenance crews faced the steepest learning curve. Technical Manual TM9731B, distributed in February 1944, included 14 pages of new instructions for wet-stowage systems. Liquid levels had to be checked before every major operation. Inspection ports required weekly examination for leaks. If a tank took damage to the hull floor, the entire ammunition storage system needed draining and inspection before the vehicle could return to combat. But the manuals arrived weeks after the tanks did. At Fort Knox, a maintenance sergeant spent 2 days trying to diagnose what he thought was a coolant leak before discovering he was looking at ammudamp seeping from a damaged ammunition bin. At Camp Campbell, a crew commander filed a defect report complaining about unexplained liquid accumulation in fighting compartment. Unaware, this was the fire suppression system functioning exactly as designed during rough terrain testing. The production transition created logistical chaos across the supply chain. By March 1944, factories were producing both wet and dry stowage Shermans simultaneously. Different models for different contracts, different theaters, different tactical requirements. A single armored division might receive 60 wet stowage tanks and 40 older dry stowage models, creating maintenance nightmares for units trying to standardize procedures. Ordnance Department records show the scale of the changeover. January 1944 produced 247 wet stowage Shermans. February 891, March 1,240. By April, nearly every M4A3 variant leaving American factories incorporated the system. But thousands of older Shermans remained in service, looking identical from the outside, yet fundamentally different in survivability. The W designation became shorthand among those who understood. Wet stowage meant protected ammunition, which meant survivable penetrations, which meant crews who could fight again tomorrow. But in England, where the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions prepared for the invasion of France, most crews loading their new W-designated Shermans onto transport ships still didn't fully understand what made these tanks different from the ones their predecessors had died in at Kasserine. They would learn the truth in Normandy, when German shells punched through their hulls and the expected funeral pyres never came. The camera tripods were positioned 200 meters from the target range, far enough for safety, close enough to capture detail. Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, March 1944. What the film crews documented over the next 6 weeks would remain classified for 19 years, not because it revealed American weakness, but because it revealed American strength. The test protocol was brutally simple. Place Sherman hulls at combat-realistic ranges, fire-capture German weapons at ammunition stowage areas, and document what happened. Test Series A used older M4A1 tanks with standard dry ammunition racks, the type that had burned across North Africa. Technicians loaded the sponson bins with live 75mm rounds, positioned the hull's broadside at 800 meters, and fired a captured 88mm PaK-43 anti-tank gun. The first shot penetrated cleanly. 3 seconds later, flames erupted from every hatch opening. The camera operator instinctively stepped back, despite being behind protective barriers. Within 10 seconds, the entire hull was engulfed, a pillar of orange fire climbing 30 feet into the gray Maryland sky, black smoke pouring from the turret ring. The ammunition cooked off in a continuous roar that lasted 40 seconds. When the fire finally subsided, nothing remained inside but slag. They fired at 11 more dry stowage hulls over the next week. 8 burned catastrophically. 3 produced intense fires that would have killed any crew, even if they didn't reach full detonation. Fire rate 73%. Test Series B began on March 29th with the first wet stowage hull positioned identically to the previous tests. Same range, same gun, same ammunition type. The 88mm round punched through the sponson with the same metallic crack. But instead of flames, liquid sprayed from the penetration hole, a pressurized jet of ammudamp that soaked the ground beneath the tank. Small wisps of smoke curled from the impact point. Then nothing. The test director ordered the camera crew to keep filming, expecting delayed ignition. After 2 minutes of silence, engineers in protective gear approached the hull. The ammunition bins had been shredded by fragments. Several rounds had been struck directly. Propellant bags were torn open, but nothing had ignited. The liquid had flooded the damaged area so quickly that combustion never reached sustainable temperatures. They tested 19 more wet stowage hulls over the following weeks, varying impact angles, penetrator types, and ammunition loads. Some tests used 75mm guns. Others used the feared 88mm. A few employed captured Panther 75mm rounds known for exceptional penetration. Of 20 wet-stowage Shermans subjected to sponson hits, only 3 burned. And even those fires were localized, producing smoke rather than the consuming infernos documented in Series A. Fire rate? 15%. The film reels were immediately classified secret and stored in Ordnance Department vaults. The statistical summary was marked confidential and distributed only to senior planners. No training films were produced, no combat bulletins were issued explaining the dramatic improvement to frontline crews. The reasoning was coldly strategic. If German intelligence learned that newer Shermans were protected against ammunition fires, they would shift tactics, aiming for engine compartments, targeting track systems, focusing on mobility kills rather than catastrophic destruction. The element of surprise was worth more than crew morale. But there was another calculation embedded in the classification decision. Thousands of older dry stowage Shermans remained in service and would continue fighting for months. Publicizing the superiority of wet stowage tanks would demoralize crews still operating the older, more vulnerable models. So the films remained locked away, and the wet stowage Shermans shipped to England carried their secret protection across the Atlantic in silence. Operation Cobra began at 0938 hours on July 25, 1944, with 1,500 heavy bombers turning a 5-mile stretch of Norman countryside into a moonscape. When the dust cleared, American armor surged through the gap at St. Lo with a ferocity that caught German defenders still reeling from the bombardment. Leading the assault, Combat Command B of the 2nd Armored Division, equipped with 97 M4A3 76W Shermans, the first wet stowage tanks to see sustained combat in Europe. Panzer Lehr Division, shattered by the aerial assault, positioned its surviving Panthers and Panzer IVs in hasty ambush positions along the hedgerows. The German crews were exhausted, under strength, and low on ammunition. But they were still some of the most experienced tank killers in the Wehrmacht. They knew how to kill Shermans. At 1340 hours, a Panther from 2 Battalion engaged 3 Shermans advancing down the Marigny Road. Range, 700 meters. The gunner placed his first shot into the lead tank's right sponson. Textbook placement. Exactly where training dictated. Direct penetration. He immediately traversed to the 2nd Sherman. Behind him, the loader called out, "First target still moving." The gunner glanced back through his periscope. The Sherman he'd just hit was reversing into cover, trailing no smoke, showing no fire. Impossible. He'd seen the penetration spark. The shot was perfect. "You missed," the commander snapped. "I did not miss." But there was no time to argue. The gunner engaged the 2nd Sherman, scored another clean hit, this time on the left sponson. Again, no fire. The tank stopped, rotated its turret, and began seeking targets. The 3rd Sherman was already firing, its 76mm rounds impacting dangerously close to the Panther's position. The German crew withdrew, confused and shaken. By nightfall, similar reports flooded up the German chain of command. Panzer crews from multiple units reported hitting American tanks that refused to burn. Commanders, reviewing the after-action reports in the ruins of a farmhouse near Tunisia, faced a troubling pattern. Confirmed penetrations without the expected catastrophic results. Oberst Theodor von Hauser, operations officer for Panzer Lehr's remnants, read through the reports with growing frustration. 11 separate engagements. 23 claimed penetrations on Sherman sponsons. Only 4 confirmed fires. His conclusion? Written in the division's war diary that night. Tank crews are overclaiming hits or misidentifying impact locations due to combat stress and poor visibility from hedgerow fighting. The alternative, that American tanks had somehow become resistant to ammunition fires, was simply too improbable to consider. German technical intelligence had thoroughly analyzed Sherman vulnerabilities. Every captured tank, every intelligence bulletin, every tactical manual confirmed the same weakness. Hit the sponson ammunition, and the tank burns. That doctrine had been validated across 3 years of combat, from Kursk to Kasserine. It couldn't suddenly become obsolete without warning. So the reports were dismissed as gunner error, poor training among replacement crews, or the fog of war. At OKW headquarters in East Prussia, the Normandy intelligence summaries made no mention of unusual Sherman survivability. The Foreign Armies West section, responsible for evaluating Allied armor developments, continued distributing tactical bulletins based on 1943 data. Diagrams still showing sponson-mounted ammunition. Recommendations still emphasizing those areas as primary aiming points. Meanwhile, in the American maintenance areas behind the front lines, recovery crews were towing in dozens of Shermans with clean penetrations through their hulls, and no fire damage. Welders patched the holes. Mechanics replaced damaged components. Within 48 hours, most of these tanks returned to combat. The Wet-Stowage system was working exactly as designed, and German intelligence remained completely blind to it. The German gunnery manual Tigerfibel, issued to every panzer crew from Normandy to the Eastern Front, contained a full-page diagram of the M4 Sherman in profile. Red cross-hatching marked the optimal aiming points. The largest red zone covered the sponson area above the tracks with a caption in bold type: Hauptziel, Munitionslager. Primary target, ammunition storage. By August 1944, this doctrine was killing German tank crews, not because it was wrong in theory, but because American engineers had quietly moved the ammunition 6 months earlier, and no German intelligence officer had noticed. Wet-Stowage Shermans stored their main gun rounds in armored bins recessed into the hull floor, positioned low and center where penetrations were statistically least likely. The old sponson racks, the ones German gunners had been trained to target since 1941, were empty. Hitting them now achieved nothing except punching a hole through vacant space. But the manuals weren't updated. Training films at Paderborn still showed instructors pointing to sponson areas with wooden pointers. Range estimation cards distributed to anti-tank units still featured the red cross-hatching over ammunition zones that no longer contained ammunition. Veteran crews, rotated back from the Eastern Front to train replacements, taught the same doctrine they'd learned in 1942. And when frontline reports contradicted this doctrine, they were systematically dismissed. A Panther commander from 2nd SS Panzer Division filed a detailed after-action report on August 8, describing 6 separate engagements where sponson hits failed to produce fires. His company commander annotated the report in red ink. Crew fatigue evident. Recommend rest rotation. The implication was clear. The gunner was making excuses for poor performance, not documenting a genuine tactical shift. A similar report from Panzerlehr reached division headquarters on August 14. The intelligence officer who reviewed it noted hits likely struck non-critical areas. Sponson strikes remain most effective method per standing doctrine. The fundamental problem was institutional inertia. German tank doctrine had been built on 3 years of validated combat experience. Sponson hits had produced fires, consistently, predictably, lethally, from Kursk to Kasserine to Kharkov. Changing doctrine required either physical evidence of American modifications or statistical proof so overwhelming it couldn't be ignored. German forces had neither. No Wet-Stowage Sherman had been captured intact. The few knocked-out examples available for inspection had been burned or demolished by their crews before abandonment. German technical intelligence teams working behind the lines could photograph external damage, but they couldn't dissect internal ammunition arrangements without controlled laboratory conditions. Conditions that didn't exist in combat zones. And the statistics were being misinterpreted. When German units reported lower than expected Sherman fire rates, staff officers attributed it to improved American crew training, better fire suppression equipment, or statistical anomalies in small sample sizes. The possibility that the fundamental design of the Sherman had changed mid-war simply wasn't considered plausible. American industry couldn't modify thousands of tanks while simultaneously fighting a two-front war. The logistics alone seemed impossible. Therefore, the reports must reflect something else, anything else, other than a wholesale redesign of ammunition storage. At the Waffenamt Technical Intelligence Center in Berlin, analysts continued working from Sherman specifications captured in Tunisia during early 1943. These documents, meticulously translated and distributed throughout the Wehrmacht, showed ammunition stored in sponson racks. Every subsequent intelligence bulletin referenced these baseline documents as authoritative. No one questioned whether they might be obsolete. So German gunners continued aiming for sponsons, continued expecting fires that increasingly failed to materialize, and continued dying when their supposedly killed targets returned fire with turrets that should have been engulfed in flames. The doctrine had collapsed, but the Germans were still following it. September 18th through October 1st, 1944. The rolling terrain east of Nancy, France, became the testing ground for a mathematical impossibility, at least according to German operational planning. The 4th Armored Division, spearheading Patton's Third Army drive toward the German border, collided with the 5th Panzer Army in a 2-week armored battle that would expose the fatal flaw in German attrition calculations. German intelligence estimated the 4th Armored possessed approximately 180 M4 Shermans at battle commencement. Their operational planning assumed standard combat mathematics. Every Sherman knocked out was a Sherman permanently removed from the order of battle. Crews killed or evacuated. Hulls burned beyond recovery. Replacement tanks weeks or months away across an Atlantic supply chain stretched to breaking. This assumption had held true from North Africa through Normandy. At Aracourt, it shattered. The Germans fought brilliantly. Panther and Panzer IV crews from the veteran 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades used terrain masterfully, positioning in tree lines and reverse slopes, engaging at ranges where their superior optics and guns provided clear advantages. They scored penetrations with the precision their training promised. By October 1st, American damage reports documented 151 Sherman losses. Tanks struck hard enough to be towed from the battlefield. Crews evacuated. Vehicles tagged for recovery. German commanders, reviewing their intelligence summaries, calculated they had effectively destroyed 84% of the 4th Armored's tank strength. Standard doctrine suggested the American division should be combat ineffective, withdrawn for refit, replaced by fresh units. Instead, the 4th Armored attacked again the next day with 140 operational Shermans. The math didn't work. What German planners couldn't see, couldn't even conceive of, was happening in the American maintenance areas 15 kilometers behind the front lines. Recovery vehicles were towing in Shermans, with clean penetration holes through their hulls, but no fire damage, no melted interiors, no ammunition-induced destruction, just holes that could be welded, components that could be replaced, systems that could be restored. Of the 151 Shermans knocked out during the battle, 110 returned to combat within 48 to 72 hours. A captured German operations map, found in a Panther abandoned near Bézange-la-Petite, illustrated the confusion perfectly. The German intelligence officer had marked American tank losses with red X's, 151 of them scattered across the battle area. Beside the map, A handwritten note in increasingly agitated script. Enemy armor strength does not match attrition figures. Request clarification on American replacement rates. The clarification never came because the German question was wrong. The Americans weren't replacing destroyed tanks at miraculous rates. They were repairing tanks that should have been total losses, tanks that 18 months earlier would have burned so completely that recovery wouldn't even have been attempted. Captain Hans von Luck, operations officer for the 111th Panzer Brigade, wrote in his personal diary on October 3rd, "We are hitting the Shermans. Our gunners are not lying. The penetrations are confirmed. But these tanks refuse to die as they did in Russia. Either American armor has been secretly upgraded or our ammunition has become defective. Both explanations seem impossible." Von Luck was half right. American armor had been upgraded, but the upgrade was invisible from outside the tank. The German after-action reports from Eracourt reached OKW headquarters in East Prussia with recommendations to investigate American industrial capacity, replacement logistics, and crew training improvements. Not one report suggested examining whether the Sherman's internal design had fundamentally changed. The Wet-Stowage system had transformed the arithmetic of armored warfare. A tank that survived penetration was a tank that could be repaired. A tank that could be repaired was a tank that returned to combat. A tank that returned to combat was effectively never lost. German planning had no category for this kind of survivability. Their entire operational doctrine was premised on attrition. Destroy enough enemy tanks, and the enemy collapses. But you cannot win a war of attrition against an opponent whose losses keep coming back. The true impact of Wet-Stowage was never measured in tanks saved. It was measured in time. A Sherman that burned required complete replacement. A replacement tank had to be manufactured in Detroit, loaded onto a Liberty ship in New York, convoyed across a U-boat-patrolled Atlantic, unloaded in Southampton or Cherbourg, transported by rail to a depot, issued to a unit, crewed by trained personnel, and driven to the front. Minimum timeline from factory to front line, 6 weeks. A Sherman with a Wet-Stowage system that survived penetration required field repair. A repair took a recovery vehicle, a maintenance crew, welding equipment, replacement parts from forward supply dumps, and 24 to 72 hours of work. Maximum timeline from battlefield to front line, 3 days. This compression of recovery time created a force multiplication effect that American logistics planners hadn't even anticipated when they authorized Wet-Stowage production. Ordnance Department statistics from the European theater, declassified in 1967, revealed the scale. Between D-Day and VE Day, U.S. armored divisions in Europe reported 17,408 Sherman tanks knocked out in combat. Of these, 11,279 were recovered and returned to service, a 65% repair rate that would have been statistically impossible with dry stowage vehicles. A dry stowage Sherman penetrated in the ammunition storage had an estimated 5% repair probability. Most became total losses. Wet-Stowage Shermans showed a 73% repair probability for identical hits. The mathematics were staggering. If those 11,279 repaired Shermans had instead been total losses requiring replacement, American factories would have needed to produce an additional 11,279 tanks just to maintain strength levels. At 1944 production rates, that represented 4 months of total Sherman output that was simultaneously supporting operations in Italy, the Pacific, and maintaining training stocks in the United States. The Wet-Stowage system had effectively gifted the U.S. Army an extra 4 months of tank production without building a single additional vehicle. But the real advantage wasn't measured in tanks. It was measured in crews. A tank crew that survived a penetration was a crew that retained its combat experience, tactical knowledge, and unit cohesion. The commander who'd learned German Panther tactics through combat experience. The gunner who'd developed intuitive range estimation. The driver who knew how to read terrain at speed. The loader who could maintain fire rates under pressure. These skills took months to develop and couldn't be mass-produced in factories. German armored formations, bleeding experienced crews at unsustainable rates, increasingly filled their Panthers and Tigers with teenagers who'd never seen combat. The Americans, thanks to Wet-Stowage survivability, kept veteran crews in the fight. A Sherman crew that survived 3 penetrations over 6 months became more lethal with each engagement, while their German counterparts were being killed and replaced with progressively less experienced personnel. The maintenance crews understood this better than anyone. Master Sergeant Raymond Kowalski, recovery section leader with the 2nd Armored Division, described it in a letter home in December 1944. "We pulled in a Sherman yesterday with an 88 hole clean through the sponson. 2 years ago, that tank would have been a write-off. Burned so bad you couldn't even salvage parts. Now, we welded a plate over the hole, replaced some wiring, topped off the wet stowage fluid, and had it back to the boys by morning. Same crew, same tank, back in the fight. The Krauts don't understand why we keep coming. Hell, half the time we're coming back in the same tanks they thought they killed last week." The German army was fighting a war of attrition against an opponent who had quietly removed attrition from the equation. December 17, 1944. The snow-covered roads of eastern Belgium became the stage for Germany's final major offensive in the West, and the final demonstration of how completely their intelligence had failed them. Kampfgruppe Piper, the spearhead of 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, smashed through American lines with a column of King Tigers, Panthers, and Panzer IVs. Their mission? Drive to the Meuse River bridges, split the Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace before American industrial power made victory impossible. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Piper's battle group encountered elements of the 7th Armored Division near Stavelot. His Panthers engaged American Shermans at ranges under 600 meters, point-blank distance for German optics and guns. The results should have been a massacre. Piper's gunners scored penetration after penetration. At such close ranges, even the Sherman's frontal armor couldn't stop Panther rounds. The Americans fought desperately, outgunned and outnumbered. But something was wrong. The Shermans weren't burning. Piper's after-action report, captured when his column was forced to abandon its vehicles near La Gleize, contained a passage that revealed the depth of German confusion. Multiple confirmed penetrations on enemy M4 tanks. Hits observed by vehicle commanders at ranges between 400 to 800 meters. Expected ammunition detonations did not occur in 70% of engagements. Tanks previously believed destroyed returned to combat within hours. Either our intelligence on American armor specifications is severely outdated, or the Americans have fielded a new tank variant externally identical to the M4. Neither explanation was correct, but both were closer to the truth than German intelligence had come in 18 months. When American forces recaptured La Gleize and interrogated abandoned German crew members, the questioning revealed systematic doctrinal confusion. A Panther gunner from 1st SS Panzer, captured on December 24th, described his experience. "We hit 7 American tanks on the first day. I saw the impacts. Clean penetrations into the sponsons where the ammunition is stored. But only 2 burned. The others withdrew or continued fighting. My commander believed I was missing, but I was not missing. Something has changed with these tanks, but no one warned us." Another captured report, this one from the operations officer of 12th SS Panzer Division, contained calculations that demonstrated how outdated intelligence was collapsing German operational planning. Intelligence estimates for American tank losses in the Ardennes sector. 340 M4 tanks destroyed between 16 to 22 December. Actual observed American armor strength. Minimal reduction. Either replacement rates from rear areas exceed all previous calculations, or our kill assessments are inaccurate. Request updated intelligence on American logistics capabilities. The request was never fulfilled because German intelligence was asking the wrong question. The Americans weren't replacing 340 destroyed tanks. They were repairing 240 damaged ones and returning them to combat within days. The distinction was invisible to German observers who still believed that a penetration equaled a kill. On December 26, as Kampfgruppe Piper was surrounded and forced to retreat on foot through the Ardennes forest, an abandoned Panther was found with a training manual wedged into the turret basket. The manual, printed in October 1944, just 2 months before the offensive, still contained the standard Sherman diagram with red cross-hatching over the sponson ammunition racks, still instructing gunners to aim for ammunition that wasn't there anymore. Still teaching doctrine based on tanks that no longer existed. A German lieutenant captured near Bastogne summarized the confusion perfectly during interrogation on December 28. We were told the Americans had weak tanks that burned easily. We were told to hit the sides where the ammunition is stored. We did exactly as trained. But these tanks, they do not die as they are supposed to. Either we have been deceived or the Americans have deceived us. He was half right. The Americans hadn't deceived German intelligence. They had simply changed their tanks 18 months earlier, and German intelligence had never noticed. The war ended on May 8, 1945. By June, Allied intelligence teams were flooding into Germany with a singular mission: collect every document, interrogate every officer, decode every secret the Wehrmacht had kept. Among the mountains of captured material, tactical manuals, intelligence bulletins, after-action reports, technical assessments, personal diaries. Researchers were searching for any mention of American wet-stowage ammunition systems. They found nothing. Not one German intelligence document referenced the modification. Not one technical report identified the double-walled ammunition bins. Not one after-action analysis mentioned liquid fire-suppressant. Not one interrogated officer, from company commanders to general staff, demonstrated awareness that Sherman internal design had fundamentally changed in January 1944. The U.S. Army's Foreign Military Studies program, which employed former German officers to write detailed operational histories, produced over 2,000 reports between 1945 and 1954. Dozens addressed American armor tactics, Sherman performance characteristics, and German anti-tank doctrine. None mentioned wet stowage. In 1948, a U.S. Ordnance Department team interviewed former Waffen-Amp technical intelligence officers specifically about their assessment of American armor developments during the war. The transcript, declassified in 1973, revealed complete ignorance. Question: were you aware of changes to Sherman ammunition storage in 1944? Response: we noted some variations in internal layout among captured specimens, but these were attributed to different manufacturers. We did not identify any systematic redesign of ammunition placement. Question: did frontline reports indicate reduced fire rates in American tanks after mid-1944? Response: some reports suggested this, but we attributed it to improved American crew training and better fire suppression equipment. We did not believe fundamental design changes were possible during wartime mass production. The German assumption that American industry couldn't modify thousands of tanks while fighting a two-front war had been their undoing. What seemed logistically impossible was exactly what American production capacity had accomplished. A post-war analysis conducted by the Aberdeen Proving Ground calculated the strategic impact. Wet stowage systems prevented approximately 8,000 catastrophic Sherman fires between June 1944 and May 1945. Those 8,000 tanks translated to roughly 40,000 saved crew members, 160,000 avoided replacement training days, and an estimated 2.8 million additional combat vehicle hours contributed to Allied operations. The modification had cost approximately $900 per tank, a total program investment of roughly $18 million. The return on that investment was incalculable. Wet stowage didn't make Shermans invincible. They still died to Panther guns, 88mm anti-tank rounds, Panzerfaust rockets, and mines. They were still outgunned by German heavy armor in direct engagements. They still required numerical superiority and tactical coordination to defeat better armored opponents. But wet stowage made them survivable. And survivability changed everything. A survivable tank was a tank that could be repaired instead of replaced. A survivable crew was a crew that grew more experienced with each engagement. A survivable force was a force that maintained strength despite casualties. Survivability transformed attrition from a weapon into an irrelevance. German doctrine had been built on a simple equation. Hit American tanks, they burn. Attrition wins the war. But the equation broke when the tanks stopped burning, and German intelligence never understood why. In the end, the most devastating American innovation of World War II wasn't a wonder weapon or a tactical breakthrough. It was a modification so subtle that the enemy never detected it, so effective that it multiplied combat power by orders of magnitude, and so secret that German forces died still believing they understood their opponent's weaknesses. The wet stowage system won its victory in silence and kept its secret for 20 years after the war ended. The Germans never knew. That was the point.